All right. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Emerging Revolutionary Wars Rev War Revelry. Tonight's topic, we're going to be covering again the 10 crucial days time period, although I think our guest here tonight will make a pretty convincing argument that 10 days should be expanded slightly to perhaps the 13 crucial days. And we're focusing again on this campaign in January 1776, 1777, as we prepare for our inaugural bus tour of the Trenton-Princeton battles. So if you are interested in joining us, we are almost sold out. I think we only have 3 or 4 tickets left. So if you're interested in joining us, you can find all those details at emergingrevolutionarywar.org. But I do want to introduce our guest tonight to talk about some of the smaller actions that happened just prior to the crossing of the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And even though these were smaller engagements and lesser known, I think after listening to our friend Adam tonight, you'll come away with a better idea of how the impacts that these actions would have reverberating through the following campaign, and how you could argue, yes, that these were 13 crucial days. But this is Adam Zielinski, who is a good friend of ours, and we've worked with him through the American Battlefield Trust, and he is up in the New Jersey area, and part of some of the local groups up there that are doing some fantastic work to tell these stories, to preserve the sites, to memorialize the sites. So it's great to have you on here, Adam. So why don't we go ahead and get started and introduce yourself. Tell us kind of who you are and what you have been working on, and we can get into some of the history of December of 1776.
All right. Thanks, Mark, for the lovely introduction there. I am a historian. I'm currently the Revolutionary War Fellow with the American Battlefield Trust, and I am one of many who are currently writing curriculum, K through 12 curriculum, and also assisting in just the broader expansion of the trust, dive into the educational component. Most people probably know them as primarily saving battlefields, and that is still their main mission, but they've in the last few years taken on shifting a little bit towards education, and that's the part of the trust that I work with. And it's been a lot of fun, a lot of great people, and everybody's just learning more and running with it. So that's a great environment to be a part of. I've the last 8 years, I have found myself continually involved in the American Revolution. It was something I kind of got started in my undergrad, and the more I read about it, the more I realized it was very misunderstood. And it was undertaught, in my opinion. And I, being fortunate enough to be a lifelong resident of New Jersey, I became more and more aware of our history tied to that time period. And my hometown of Mount Holly, which we're going to talk about this evening, has some very unique history that ties directly to the Battle of Trenton. And you would call it the success of not only that campaign, but potentially the entire war for independence. If we are quoting Hessian Captain Johann Ewald correctly, which I will show at some point this evening. But it's just been a fun journey. And, I've met you, Mark. I met a lot of other people along the way. And it's really, it's a good community of people, particularly when not everybody is 65 years old. And I say that all with love for people of that age and older who love our history. But my fascination and interest is really turning the younger generations onto it. And so that's really what kind of wakes me up every day and drives me to do what I do. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. And that's what we need. Yeah, we need to get, and that's part of what Emerging Revolutionary War is trying to do, get a greater audience to hear some of these stories. So what we're talking about tonight is, the Battle of Ironworks Hill, and I guess to set the stage, so to speak, It's December 1776. Washington has lost New York. His army's being driven across New Jersey, crosses at Trenton into Pennsylvania. It's early December. Howe is deciding, he's going to, head back to New York for winter quarters. In the process, he sets up this post system to try and, I guess, quell the countryside there. The story usually starts for Trenton around there, where we talk about how Colonel Johann Rall and 3 Hessian regiments are stationed at Trenton. And of course, Washington, and the story goes, is going to cross the Delaware, attack them, and win this great victory. But they weren't the only Hessians over there, right? So
Right.
why don't you set us up here about what's going on in December 1776 in New Jersey around that time?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Johann Rall is the Hessian commander at Trenton at the time, but he's actually not the commander of the Hessian units at Trenton. This is actually a man by the name of Karl von Donop. He is actually the forward commander of Trenton. And the British commander in charge of New Jersey is General James Grant, who's actually at New Brunswick. But von Donop is the forward commander of all the garrisons that you just mentioned that kind of string westward from New Brunswick all the way to Trenton. And von Donop finds himself in an interesting position where he has his own force of about 2,400 troops, we think. And Trenton is far too small to encamp the combined forces that von Donop has, along with the forces that Rall has. So von Donop takes it upon himself to move his portion of his forces south to Bordentown, which is about 10 miles south of Trenton along the Delaware River. And von Donop sets up his brigade in Bordentown with kind of an eye of, well, I can't fit everybody at Bordentown either. So I'm going to kind of stretch out my forces along the countryside, but they're close enough where, if we hear a cannon shot from Trenton, knowing that something's going down, we can, run right back and reinforce Rall in case trouble comes. So von Donop spreads out his forces from Bordentown, where he sets up his headquarters. He sets part of his battalion up at, part of his brigade up at Crosswicks, and then he sends another portion southward to Black Horse, which is modern day Columbus. And from here, he kind of has a good earshot over the countryside of Burlington County, which at the time was pretty much the seat of West Jersey, if you will. Burlington was the seat of West Jersey. It was the capital of Burlington County. And von Donop actually has his eye on Burlington at this time. And Burlington is just south of Bordentown, for those that don't know. I think it's about 20 miles from Philadelphia. I have to look that up to be sure, but it's roughly fairly close. And there's American galleys that are patrolling the waters on the Delaware. And they're basically harassing, the Hessians and British parties that are kind of coming in and out of Burlington. And this is, obviously something the Hessians are trying to get rid of, because their eye is, well, we have to get rid of all this resistance if we want to take our big prize, which is no secret, Philadelphia. Come the springtime, once the snows, melt and whatnot, they're going to take Philadelphia. And they're under the assumption that Washington is finished, that his army in Newtown, Pennsylvania is, by all intents and purposes, they're done. Washington himself at the time is kind of, thinking the same thing himself. There's definitely moments in his correspondence where he's going back and forth with, we're through, but I don't want to give up. I mean, he never gives up, but he's definitely battling this internal, conflict of, do I do something? And, reality is reality. And this is the situation. So, but yeah, the Hessians that are south of Trenton, though, they spread themselves out across Burlington County, and they're patrolling, they're foraging a little bit here and there, but they're really just kind of prodding the countryside, trying to see, where there's resistance, if it does exist. And they're running into some pickets and skirmishers here and there, but for the most part, it's not a big deal. Now they come into Mount Holly on December 13th, and they come through town. The town has mostly been deserted at this point because of news of the approaching British and Hessians up north. And they kind of get word of, there might be some troops lingering in the area in the countryside out of sight. But other than that, no real concern. And von Donop actually says at this point to one of his subordinates, who is Captain Johann Ewald, he's captain of the 2nd Company of Jaeger Rangers, that when this is successful, meaning they take over more of Burlington County, I'm going to award you Mount Holly. So that was already in the works, that Mount Holly was going to be given to Ewald as a post for even more of a spread out, if you will, of taking over New Jersey. So at the same time this is all happening and von Donop's kind of gallivanting through the countryside, a Virginia colonel arrives in Philadelphia by the name of Samuel Griffin. And in Philadelphia at the time is Major General Israel Putnam. And he is the commandant of Philadelphia at the time, essentially military governor of the city. And Putnam is under orders essentially from Washington and higher ups to arm Griffin with whatever he can and send him into New Jersey and basically just make life miserable for the Hessians. And he gets a really like a hodgepodge of whoever's willing to go with him. It's a bunch of Virginian regulars. There's a bunch of Philadelphia volunteers, and then he basically picks up the rest from New Jersey, which is militia from Cumberland, Salem, and Gloucester counties. All told, about 600 militia, roughly. They have, I think, 2 or 3 light field pieces, but we also know that over half of their forces are no older than the age of 16.
Wow.
So let that sink in. I mean, this is literally an army of teenagers with no military, training or discipline whatsoever. And Griffin is taking them into Burlington County to see if he can, harass these Hessians and see what he can make of them. So that's the situation that's kind of unfolding into the 3rd week of December 76, while all these bigger events that are about to happen in the next week or so are still in the very early phase of gestation, if you will, because Washington still hasn't committed to attacking Trenton. He's still on the fence. He knows he's got to do something because he realizes, more than half of his soldiers' enlistments expire at the end of the year, that, what remains of the Continental Army is literally going to walk away. He gets word that obviously Charles Lee's been, that he's been taken prisoner, but also he's going to receive reinforcements from Gates and a couple other people. So there's a lot of moving parts here that kind of all have to fall into place for Washington to really be able to do something. And it's still very uncertain at this point. But as we'll get into in a few minutes here, this small band of 600 mixed units under Griffin in Burlington County, Washington takes an interest in them and takes an interest in what they possibly could do to really resolve his situation leading up to Trenton. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you talk about, the situation Washington is in, and when he writes about, you talk about in his dispatches writing, he thinks the game is pretty near up to his family members and stuff. I mean, it is a dire situation. But yeah, and you're right. And I feel like in a lot of narratives, you hear about Charles Lee being captured, you hear about his army disintegrating over in Pennsylvania. But yeah, this Griffin force, I think, is often overlooked. But they're gonna, and I think it's fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah, that most of them were as young as they were. But it's pretty interesting. So they send them over in New Jersey just to try and harass the Hessian soldiers that are there in the countryside. And the Hessians also have like a pretty bad reputation, for plundering and looting in the countryside there, which I don't think is earning them any friends in the area for sure.
We will touch on that when we get to the identity of the widow of Mount Holly, but we'll wait to that part of the story when that unfolds.
Yeah, I'm excited about that part. So
yeah, we'll circle back to that part about the Hessians, because I have a theory. We have a theory that might play into why her identity is still unknown. So yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, but yeah, no, they have and you can imagine also, just the Hessians in general have a pretty fearsome reputation, whether it's warranted or not. I mean, they were definitely feared for their combat in New York. And is that also a reason? I've heard like that this forward post of Donup's Hessians and stuff like that is that was part of that was because of their having served so bravely at Fort Washington and other parts in the campaign, that they were kind of given the tip of the spear there, as you said, kind of the front post there, waiting during the winter before that spring campaign when they can finally take Philadelphia. So
yes, that's exactly right. Von Donop was awarded that position specifically for his actions at in the New York campaign, and just to piggyback off that too, his arrogance, to not overuse a word here, but is also the arrogance of the British at the time. And they are the biggest, baddest army in the world at the time, playing by all the military rules of the age. They think they have this thing won. They think it's a slam dunk, and that this Mr. Washington is done. So they have really no respect for him. We know Johann Rall doesn't think anything of the Americans. So he's, any correspondence that he's receiving in Trenton, he's just kind of dismissing outright, like, I don't care. So there is this mode of arrogance amongst the soldiers there, and we're going to see it in Von Donop's decisions in the next few days. But we're also going to see it called out by Ewald, though, which is kind of interesting, because he really, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a sec, but Ewald really is kind of like the counterweight to all of these really poor decisions that Von Donop ends up making. And we only know about it because of Ewald's diary, which was discovered in 1979. Before that, we were all only going on, 19th century assumptions of what took place here. And because of Ewald's diary, we know now that a lot of these assumptions were based in fact. So it really just completely upended all of these 19th century suspicions that kind of, downplayed all these events. But now we know, like, no, something actually happened here. We're not saying it was this big, but like clearly things happened here that were really important and vital to these bigger events. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that in that source, Ewald's diary is fantastic, and it's published now, and you can actually get copies of it, and it's fantastic because he keeps awesome records, and then also just the everywhere he saw, from not only New York campaign and New Jersey, but then also even the Southern campaign later in the war. I mean, it's a fantastic resource. But you're right, for how many years not having that other side of the story is pretty crucial.
It was a big missing piece to the puzzle. Yeah,
that's great. All right, so what's going to happen then after the Hessians are out here? What's Griffin going to do to either try and how is he making their life miserable? Is he being successful? Is he going to be able to lure them away from and we can get to this at some point, but what's the coordination also like between his force and what Washington's doing on the other side of the Delaware?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's interesting to know. Yeah, how much because Washington's keeping an eye. Is that going to influence any of his plans and stuff like that? So
right. All right, I'm going to share my screen with the audience here, just to I have some maps and some things to go along with it here. Good to go?
Oh yeah, looks great.
Okay, cool. So as we said, this is a map in New Jersey, and the garrisons, if you will, marked in red, and we like to call them a spear, if you will. And the spear is facing their objective, which is Philadelphia. And the tip of the spear is Trenton, as you can see on this map. Now, these are some of the garrisons that, or positions rather, that Von Donop has at Bordentown, Crosswicks, and Black Horse. And then I have further down, you see Mount Holly in a blue dot, which will represent Griffin. I'll skip this quote real quick. This is from Captain Ewald. So the first, so how this begins is on December 21st, Griffin's forces come into Mount Holly. They had originally come into Haddonfield, and then they made essentially their headquarters at Morristown, which is a stone's throw away from Mount Holly. And on the 21st, they come into Mount Holly. They build a series of entrenchments rather on a spot called Ironworks Hill, which is just south of the Rancocas Creek. And at the time, it was the site of an ironworks, hence its name. It's currently the site of St. Andrew's Cemetery. There was a church on the hill at the time. So the Americans under Griffin built a series of entrenchments on the mount. We think they also built, or rather on the hill, we think they also built a series of entrenchments on the mount itself, which is just north of the center of town, which you'll see in a sec on another map here. I'm basically just setting everything up for you. And so on the 21st, Griffin's men are doing this, and we think a detachment of them actually proceed north along the Slabtown Road into Slabtown, which is modern day Jacksonville. And just further beyond that, at a crossroads called Petticoat Bridge over the Assacunk Creek, which is essentially the center point between Slabtown and Black Horse, which is where the southern detachment of Von Donop's forces were stationed at the time. So right here on the 21st, we get the first engagement of this phantom army that Von Donop had heard about a few days before, but he had heard that it was a force of 3,000 troops, which obviously is not true. We don't know, if it was deliberate misinformation or if it was just, secondhand, which was equally possible, but it was obviously inaccurate information. Nevertheless, Von Donop is aware that there's some, there are American forces in the vicinity somewhere. On the 21st, a small portion of these, troops run into his forces at the Petticoat Bridge. They pull out. We only know about this because the next day, Von Donop passingly writes about last night, there was a skirmish with a few enemy troops. So we know something took place here. But on the following day, on the 22nd, a second skirmish takes place at Petticoat Bridge, and this was much larger. This was almost a full-scale engagement. Again, we're basing this off of very sketchy historical information, so we're trying our best not to presume, but it seems, based on Ewald's diary and a couple of other firsthand accounts, that there was a couple hundred Americans involved in this. So whether it was the full size of Griffin's force or most of it, we're not sure. But we do know that a large force of Americans attacked the guardhouse that overlooked the Petticoat Bridge on the 22nd around 2 o'clock. And this sent the southern portion of Von Donop's forces at Black Horse into a frizzy. They sent off their signal cannon. Von Donop had, he was at Bordentown at the time. He heard the signal cannon go off, so he comes racing to Black Horse. At the meantime, as I show you on this map, Ewald is actually at his post at a place called the Bunting House, which is a couple miles west of Slabtown. And he hears all this commotion going on in his rear. And at the same time, a small skirmish breaks out between his post and a bunch of unknown Americans too. So he's taken on this, and then he fights them off, and he comes back to Black Horse to report, what he just went through. And based on these two interactions, Von Donop now decides, with the encouragement of Sterling, one of his battalion chiefs, that this rumor of a 3,000 man American force is true. Like, this is definitely, this is plausible now. There's definitely an enemy force present right over the hill somewhere towards Mount Holly. And Von Donop, again, we're going back to use that word arrogance. I don't know if it's full arrogance or if it's just under the assumption that, hey, we're a good match for him, is what he said. He decides on his own that he's going to take the fight to Griffin's force. Now, where the historiography really has historically gotten it wrong is that it's usually written that Griffin was sent in to be a diversion, to purposely lure von Donop further south from Bordentown. Now, through our research, we find that that is not true. Von Donop decided to move on his own. It was just coincidental that that is what Washington ultimately wanted Griffin to do. But the wheels were already in motion based on what the Hessians had decided to do. So it was just a happy coincidence that that was the initiative that von Donop decided to undertake.
One of many happy coincidences that seems to happen during this campaign. So
exactly. So early. All right. So on the evening of the 22nd, Joseph Reed, who is George Washington's adjutant general at the time, he's in correspondence with Griffin in New Jersey, and he sends word to Washington about what's going on in Burlington County with Griffin's force. And the first quote here I have is the letter from Reed to Washington on December 22nd. And the last sentence I have highlighted here, and Reed basically tells Washington that, we should support Griffin, and that if we can coordinate with him with this upcoming big attack you have planned on Trenton, that this could be another phase of that giant attack on New Jersey that just completely obliterates this forward posting of the British Hessian command in New Jersey. And Washington writes back, as you see in the bottom here, that he's encouraging Reed to reach out to Griffin, and that he wants Griffin to be a part of it. He's totally bought into this idea. He's like, please coordinate with him and use him as the Southern attack, if you will, the Southern spear of our attack on New Jersey. Washington also reaches out to John Cadwalader, who's going to be given the command of the Southern approach of Washington's giant plan to cross the Delaware and attack Trenton on three folds. And Cadwalader is given the assignment of coming over from Bristol, Pennsylvania, into Burlington County and basically closing off the Southern retreat from Trenton in case anybody gets out. That's usually the story that we're told anyway, but I don't have it here. But if you actually read the correspondence between Reed, Cadwalader, and Washington and these critical few days here right before Trenton, Washington's telling Cadwalader that I need you to meet up with Griffin, and I need you to take the fight to these Hessians in Mount Holly. I mean, he specifically says Mount Holly several times. So Washington's like pretty clear that his eye is where it is, and that he wants there to be a major engagement at Mount Holly to coincide with his attack on Trenton. Okay. So now we're on to the morning of December 23rd. As I just said, von Donop has decided on his own that he's going to move his forces at Bordentown, Crosswicks, and Black Horse, combine them, which we think is about 2,400 in total, and he's going to move south and attack Mount Holly and rid himself of this rebel force in waiting. As I have here, the rumors of a 3,000-man army are not true. Obviously, Griffin only has 600, and von Donop, we think, has about 2,400, give or take. So they meet for a third time in 3 consecutive days at Pepeco Bridge. We know this time that there was only a handful of Americans. It was not the same amount that was there the previous day. We're going to estimate and say it was probably no more than 50 to 100. And when they came down the Pepeco Bridge Road, which is illustrated in this map from 1778 by British Lieutenant John Hills, when they came down the road on the 23rd, they found von Donop's entire army marching at him. So, whether it was 50 or 100, it didn't matter. They were facing a humongous army in comparison to what they had. So we know they fired at least one round. They checked the initial advance. And then as soon as the Hessians regrouped and returned fire, the Americans broke. There was no fight It was just one volley and that was it. We know there was more Americans in waiting at Slabtown on the morning of the 23rd. And as soon as the forward Americans came running back, everybody broke and started retreating. So it was a very disorganized retreat. We also think this is why when you read von Donop, but especially Ewald's account of the ensuing battle here, he kind of breezes through this part of the day's battle. And it makes sense, because why would he include any detail about a disorganized retreat of the Americans? It's there's no reason to, because it serves no importance for him or for them, because to them they were just marching straight through.
They've seen it for a few weeks already.
Yes, exactly. Right. They were not impressed with that they were coming up against. So this is a continuation of Hills's map. This shows further down from Slabtown, and you can see Mount Holly in the bottom left-hand corner. And this shows the retreat of both armies using the Slabtown road to get back into Mount Holly. If you read Ewald's diary, he indicates that as they approached Mount Holly, they came across a hill with a church on it. Now, we know using topographical maps from the 20th century that he actually misidentified where he was looking. Hills actually marks on this the church that Ewald's talking about. This is actually this is the original, rather, meeting house from Mount Holly. Today, there's a cemetery still present. This map's from 1947, I believe, and I've indicated in white where the old road used to be. Nonetheless, the mount is still present in the bottom portion of this map and is still present to this day. So when the Americans came running back into town, they took up the position on the high ground, which of course would be the mount. And this is what the mount looked like from a 1905 postcard. And we're pretty sure this is probably very similar to what they saw in the late 18th century, considering it was very underdeveloped at the time. It was wide open. There was little vegetation or trees. So it's easy to understand why Ewald would have, probably misidentified, because it was hilly coming up. And when he saw the church and then saw the mount behind it, he just didn't correct his journal. So we'll forgive him for this. And this is more of what Ewald writes, talking about their approach. And he specifically talks about how on their approach to the mount, rather, von Donop decides to split his forces into three different columns to envelop the mount. Now, why would he do that unless he assumed there was a sizable force entrenched on the mount? If it was only 10 guys, he would not be doing such a maneuver. But again, because of the intel that he was, thinking that was correct, he decides to divide his entire force to envelop the mount. So we have, maybe 50 to 100 Americans on the mount, and we have this entire Hessian brigade that's getting ready to literally lay siege to it. It's not a long battle. The Americans fire, we think, maybe, a volley or two. And what ensues is a running battle through High Street, which is downtown Mount Holly. And this is how, if you are familiar with Ironworks Hill Day, which is a reenactment the town has every year, for a long time, they actually did reenact this part of the battle where you had soldiers running, chasing each other right down, downtown Mount Holly. And this is where that part of the story comes from, because we know for a fact that that's what happened. Basically, the 42nd Highlanders chased the 16-year-old militia Americans through town, and all the way back to the Ironworks Hill, again on the south side of the Rancocas Creek. So the Americans, they take the entrenchments that they had dug on the 21st. Meanwhile, the Hessians position their artillery on the mount, also on a small bluff to the east of downtown Mount Holly, and they just pound Ironworks Hill for the rest of the evening. There's no resistance. By mid-evening, overnight, what Americans hadn't retreated, from the initial run through town, they were gone. They left to Morristown. So the Hessians at this point have Mount Holly. It's completely theirs. Ewald has his garrison, if you will. And we know through Ewald's journal, he estimates they have about 200 prisoners. So if that is the case, that's a third of Griffin's original force, which says a lot, which says that there was not much of a fight, and that whatever organization these guys had was very disorganized. And so from here, we have to also, unfortunately, I have to backtrack just a slight bit, but not too much. So while all this is happening, Colonel Griffin is taken ill, and he writes about it in his, Reed writes about it, that he's taken ill. Cadwalader writes about it to Washington. And so this is happening. Washington's, planning all these things for Trenton, and he's got this one kernel of hope that maybe this Griffin and this situation around Mount Holly can be a real thorn in the, in the boot of the Hessians. What he's not aware of is that Griffin becomes incapacitated. And our speculation is that this plays into the disorganization of his mixed units. And in the correspondence between Reed and Washington on the 24th, Reed basically tells Washington that Griffin is, he can't command his force anymore. Basically, somebody else needs to. And you can see in Washington's letters back to Reed, he hasn't given up on Griffin. He keeps insisting that, like, no, like if Griffin can't do it, maybe we can send Cadwalader in there or send somebody else in there. Washington is so focused on not losing this potential, foothold in Burlington County, that he's willing to really devote a lot of writing to, trying to save face of this deteriorating situation. And but it's not
too.
Yeah, go ahead.
His army itself only has a few thousand guys.
Right.
Anyway, the fact that
he's desperate for anybody. Right.
Correct. That's a sizable force putting up resistance. I'm sure he has wants to see them be successful in some way. So
right. So, and this is an unfinished map I've done of Mount Holly, and this shows all the houses and everything from 76, but it just shows how the Hessians had spread out over the town. You can see the Americans in the bottom corner there on Ironworks Hill, and how they make their exit. And so Von Donna, another map I did. So Von Donna decides to stay in Mount Holly. He doesn't go back to Bordentown, and we don't really know why. And there's several speculations why, and we have a really good understanding why, and that comes in the identity or mysterious identity of a widow. And we don't unfortunately know who she is, and she only is written about in I think it's only in two journals. One is Ewald's, and the other is by a woman named Margaret Hill Morris. She was a resident of Burlington. And she only kept a very brief diary during December of 76, convenient for our purposes. And she's writing, and as I said, from Burlington, where there was a lot of interest in monitoring the ships and galleys on the river at the time. She was writing of how the Hessians and Americans were interchangeably coming and going in town every day. And she was serving tea rather to Hessian officers at 1:00 in the afternoon, and then Colonel Reed and Cadwalader at 4:00 in the afternoon. So she was literally, wining and dining both sides. So we don't really know where her loyalties lie, but she passively gives reference that on the 20th of December, before all these events take place, that there is a woman of our acquaintance in Mount Holly when everybody else in town had seemingly abandoned the town. So she specifically calls out some lady that stayed behind. And then we get Ewald's diary that basically says flat out that Von Donop was enchanted by this beautiful young widow of a doctor. And Ewald does not give a name to this woman, but Von Donop decides to spend the next 3 days quartered with this woman. We do know that Von Donop was injured during the day's events. We don't know how, but he took a head wound some point during the day. So he decided that he needed to rest up for 3 days, and he picked this fair lady to be his acquaintance. And so coupled with this, and also, as I said, Mount Holly was completely abandoned at the time. But thanks to Ewald, once again, we know that Mount Holly's liquor supply had not been abandoned. It was fully in stock. So it was not the Hessians at Trenton getting drunk on Christmas. It was the Hessians in Mount Holly that were getting drunk. And as I said earlier, Von Donop, he was unable to, his forces were unable to encamp together. They had to spread out very thinly over the countryside because there were so many of them. And these small hamlet towns were just too small to, to accommodate a force of his size. Mount Holly, on the other hand, was the first town that could accommodate everybody. So given the fact that they had liquor, they had, just supplies, the weather was, crappy. It had snowed on the evening of the 24th, and Von Donop was in great company at the moment. There was no reason for any of these guys to want to leave. There was no, and again, the arrogance. They did not really think that anything bad was going to happen, except for Ewald. He writes about saying, don't take this Washington guy for granted. If I know him, he's desperate, meaning he's liable to attack because of desperation. And sure enough, Ewald was proven right. And I include this quote here from Ewald, where he says in his diary specifically that the entire loss of the 13 colonies can be rested on Colonel Donop, who was led by the nose to Mount Holly by Colonel Griffin and detained there by love. So we know how Ewald felt about the entire situation, and apparently, apparently Von Donop also had some feelings about it afterwards. So anyway, December 26th comes, and Washington obviously attacks Trenton. Cadwalader never makes it across the Delaware. So Washington, as we know, his three-pronged attack is only a single prong, which is his portion of the army. And it never was meant to be that Mount Holly would be included because Cadwalader never showed up. But that being said, news reaches Mount Holly, and they find out that Trenton's lost. They immediately leave in the afternoon. They report back to Bordentown and then to Trenton, and immediately, inquiries are made. What happened? Why weren't you where you're supposed to be? Von Donop gave a cover story that they were in Mount Holly trying to gain petitioners to the king and cause, and that it was all about a recruitment campaign, and no mention, of course, of any widow that he fell and fancied with. But so all this takes place, and Von Donop's reputation is completely destroyed. As you said, like, he was given this forward command because of his, heroics, if you will, during the New York campaign. Well, now his reputation's in shambles. And Ewald writes in his diary that, the troops under him are all kind of running their mouths saying hey, you really blew it. Like, we really shouldn't have been down there, the way we were, just kind of, just going about things. So a year later, Von Donop leads a disastrous charge at the Battle of Red Bank, and he's killed. I mean, he's mortally wounded, and he dies. And he's actually one of the only I think he's the only officer buried on the battlefield. So he tried to reclaim his reputation by leading this, this charge, which was, obviously foolhardy, and he was, he didn't survive. So he was aware himself that he blew it, and that his reputation had taken a hit. And
Does he after this campaign? I mean, well, after Trenton, as you said, he goes up to Trenton, and then is he going to be involved at all in when Cornwallis comes down eventually for the second Battle of Trenton or the Battle of Princeton, or was he
I
kind
should
of?
know that offhand. I know he was. I know he was there. I don't think he was. I don't think he was any of the Ford, battle.
Hmm,
Either on the second Battle of Trenton, rather, and I know obviously he wasn't involved at Princeton. So,
yeah.
yeah. But yeah, the interesting thing about all of that is um, going back to Washington and his his correspondence with Cadwalader and Reed and Griffin. And it's really interesting and I encourage everybody. I mean, you can go on Founders online and read the correspondence. I mean, it's clear as day. Washington, as we were saying, like, because he's so desperate, because he has so few men, and he realizes what's at stake here. He's willing to try anything. He's like, just throw it against the wall and see if it sticks. And that's kind of his mentality with this idea of attacking Von Donop in Burlington County. And based on what my group is currently researching and has researched, we really think that had the Americans not attacked Petticoat Bridge on December 22nd, and had they waited 2 days for reinforcements, there probably would have been a major engagement against Von Donop's forces around Mount Holly around Christmas. But because the Americans attacked on the 22nd, remember, Griffin was, as I said, he was incapacitated. We don't even know if he was commanding his troops at the time. He could have been laid up in bed somewhere. We don't know. And we know, again, his forces, they did have Virginia regulars, they had some artillery, but it was mostly militia and Philadelphia volunteers who, again, were very young. So there was very little discipline in the force. If they attacked on the 22nd and they hastily decided to attack, and then they were driven off, and then they decided, well, our commander's not feeling well, we just kind of got our butts kicked, maybe we've done all we can do. You can see morale start to kind of disintegrate by the 23rd. And then by the 24th, morale is completely disintegrated. And Reed actually attests to this in a letter to Washington saying, Griffin's forces are in shambles. And Washington's like, no, you got to hold it together. And Reed's like, I'm telling you, like, there's not much left to hold together. And that's why Washington's like, you got to, Cadwalader, get in there, somebody go in there and salvage this thing. And so anyway, had the Americans waited 2 days and not attacked Petticoat Bridge on the 22nd, they might have had those reinforcements, because there would have been more of an initiative to get those reinforcements over before morale had, plunged and their forces had deteriorated on their own. So it's really a matter of what ifs. It could have really played into Washington's rather Washington's plan of attack there, and who knows what would have became of Von Donop's forces there.
If Von Donop was back up at Bordentown, would he be able to reinforce Trenton that morning? Then that could have potentially, changed that course of history there too, right?
I think so. Yeah. And as you know, I mean, you've written a nice book about this. Trenton was, Trenton had many factors working in the Americans' favor. And I think artillery played a huge factor in it, because, obviously firing a musket in those weather conditions was nearly impossible. But the fact that the Americans had a tremendous, a tremendous amount of artillery, considering they only had a couple thousand, troops with them, I think that's really played a decisive factor. So I don't know how that would have played into more reinforcements, from the Hessian side of things. It certainly would have made it a lot more interesting. I want to give the Hessians the advantage because they would have had more, infantry. But yeah, it just, the fact that they were not present at Bordentown, it really, it made Washington's victory that much easier. And I hate to say it that way, but it's the truth,
Fascinating. Well, yeah, no, this is great. I think this is oh yeah, if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about what you guys are doing to commemorate the site today. So yeah, what's there today?
Yeah.
And what are you guys doing to enhance that?
So, so this is a drawing I did back in April. The group I'm with is the Rev War Alliance of Burlington County, and we're just a bunch of local historians. We're not as I tell people, we're not politically affiliated. We're literally just a bunch of historians, and we're just focused on interpretation and doing history and doing the education side of things. And so there was a marker put rather on Ironworks Hill at the bicentennial in '76. And that is represented in this sketch by the flagpole, and what you see below it is a stone marker. And this is all owned by St. Andrew's Cemetery and Church in Mount Holly. And we discussed with them back in the spring the idea of, for the upcoming 250th, why don't we do something to really enhance the visitor experience and really draw attention to, what unfolded here and what we just discussed for the last, hour. And they liked the idea. So this was just a composite sketch of, if you will, the throwing everything at it, the kitchen sink and every idea, that a dream, whatever you want to call it, that we could think of to really enhance it. So what we're focused on right now is doing phase one. And I just want to be very clear, phase one is just going to be reading boards, interpretive signs. And we're going to do park benches, some rail fencing, and a new flagpole, and that is it. So we did a Gofundme campaign back in June, and we raised some money. Those affiliated with your viewing audience and members who donated, thank you so much. That was tremendous. We are much obliged and grateful. We haven't forgotten about you. Don't worry. We are just working out final details with the cemetery, and I know there's an issue right now with supply shortages, and so gathering some of the materials is just taking a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but it's still going underway, and we're hoping that within the next month we can have the majority of it done. I know the interpretive signs are going to probably be done by the end of the year. So this is going to be something that will be visibly present as we get closer to the 250th. And if the community really buys into it and there's a lot of positive feedback and whatnot, then we'll talk about perhaps adding to it, which is represented here by, maybe another obelisk or a monument of some kind, maybe a cannon to represent the artillery, shelling. But we are going to do some interpretive signs around town that are going to discuss the widow, who she might have been, and also some signs talking about Ewald, showing some of his maps that he did while in Mount Holly in '76. And yeah, just really, just opening the story up to everybody and just saying, like, listen, like, we're by no means experts. We're just interested, and we're historians. So we're trying to apply the expert lens to things, but this story's for everybody. If you're interested in it and you're drawn to it, there's plenty of research that still needs to be done to really try to discover some of these individuals, and particularly the widow. She's the linchpin in the whole story. I mean, she really is the centerpiece, and it's awesome that it came down to a woman. I guess when I tell this story to people, complete strangers, particularly women, and I tell them that, they smile every time, like, that's unbelievable. I'm like, it really is. It's just unfortunate we don't have a name to go with it, and hopefully someday we can fix that. Yeah.
I gotta say, it reminds me, my guy friends are gonna get on me for this, but me and my wife is a big fan of the TV show, The Gilmore Girls. Uh, and in this TV show, it takes place in a fictional New England town. They do a reenactment every year of a Revolutionary War battle. And part
Yeah.
of that reenactment was a story almost identical to this story, where there's a widow who in this story, she's a patriot spy who kept the British kept in that town or whatever. So I think it's a fascinating story that there's actual some truth to a story similar to that occurred during
Yeah.
the revolution there at Mount Holly, and I think that's fascinating. And did you say do they do a reenactment every year of the battle? Is that something that they've stopped doing, or is that something that people would be able to? Do you have any information about that?
So it's typically on the second Saturday of December every year.
Oh, okay.
I know this year I'm 90% sure they're doing it. I know there's still discussion on just the logistics of everything. If you go, I know Mount Holly's website, Mount Holly, New Jersey. They will definitely post information on their main webpage. Also, if you look up the Burlington County Lyceum, it's a natural science and history lyceum. They pretty much run Ironworks whole day, so they will have information available when it comes, when they figure out the logistics. But yeah, it's it's a lot of history in this town. It's great, we can tie it all back to some big events there.
Yeah, no, I think it shows you the importance of that local history component. The stuff, it doesn't get as top billing as Trenton and Princeton, but as you see from what Ewald said and other things like that, I mean, you just see like these smaller actions, and also the actions of women and other people involved, have reverberating effects. So it's kind of neat to try and learn more about that, and then to try tell that story through different means. Now, if people want to know more about your Rev War Alliance, about this, how can they, follow you guys? How can they learn more? Do you guys have a website or anything else like that?
Sure. The best way to follow us is on Facebook. You can just follow Rev War Alliance of Burlington County, and it should come right up. And we're regularly posting things on there about what we're doing. If you're a resident of the area, we're always taking new members and trying to just expand our network. And again, just general interest. If and as I tell people all the time, if the Rev War is not your thing, I totally get it. I understand. I'm not insulted by that, but I'm sure there's some aspect of history that you do find interesting. And I always say, like, well, that's where we can find common ground and maybe work for each other. And it's like, if you can buy into what I have, maybe I can help you out and buy into what you have. So that's my approach anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And yeah, like I said, that area of New Jersey and Pennsylvania is just, New Jersey's crossroads of the Revolution. You have so many different important events happening there. So it's great. You get to live up there, and we are anybody who's interested again in visiting that. Like I say, we got 4 tickets left on the bus tour that's happening November 12th through 14th. So coming up here less than a month. So we hope to see some of you there. Otherwise, thank you, Adam, for coming on this evening and educating us all about these the important 13 crucial days that December 1776. And tune in with us 2 more weeks on Halloween. We're going to be having some guys talking about some spooky Hessian stories. Probably the most famous, the Headless Hessian, the Headless Horseman. We'll probably talk some about the popular culture that's kind of come from the Hessian experience here in America. So, but thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all in a couple weeks.